Rise up, Tommy Brine, rise up and tell me true. Didn't I go down to Pickardstown tonight along with you? We went to fight the foeman there, close by the great salt sea. And what befell, sure I needn't tell, 'twas for Ireland to be free.
100 years ago, in January 1921, a group of men assembled here from Waterford City and from Dunhill and Tramore. They were the East Waterford Brigade of the I.R.A. The commander, Paddy Paul, had come up with an idea of ambushing British soldiers from Waterford, just outside Tramore town at Pickardstown. They came here for one reason, because here in St. Othran's Hospital, then it was known as a mental hospital, there was an arms dump belonging to the I.R.A. There were several of them around the city. There was one up in Gray's Dew, there was one down in Spring Garden Alley, there was another one in Thomas Street, in a garage in Thomas Street, belonged to a skin and hide merchant called Woodman and Madison. And my granduncle, John Creed, was a quartermaster in that in the I.R.A. at the time, and he had a key for that one in Thomas Street belonging to Woodman and Madison. So they got some of the guns from various dumps, brought them up here. There was a hay shed here in the grounds of the mental hospital, and they got the guns and they distributed the guns. Every man was to get a shotgun or a rifle. A fella called Tom Brennan was to bring him across country from here, right across, in more or less single file, until they arrived at Pickardstown. Now, I'll have to jump forward towards the end of the ambush, because the ambush didn't go too well, for a simple reason, is that even here it was discovered, when they were being inspected here and they were being addressed, that one of the officers had drink taken. 3 men in actual fact had drink taken. They should have been sent home, but they weren't. They were allowed go, they were disarmed of their shotguns and their rifles, and they were given revolvers. But it had tragic consequences, resulting in the end in the death of 2 I.R.A. men. So this is where it all began, on the 7th of January, about 7 o'clock in the evening. They all assembled here, got their arms, and marched off to Pickardstown in Tramore, to what was known as the Pickardstown Ambush. Part of the plan of action for the Pickardstown Ambush, the first thing that the volunteers were to do was come up here, up as far as the centre of the town, and to attack Black and Tan and I.R.A. patrol that went out nightly. However, the West Waterford lads were an hour late because one of the cars were after breaking down, so they arrived here an hour late. So they had to very quickly change their plans, and the plan was then to attack the police barracks here in Queen Street in Tramore. And 12 men were selected from the West Waterford and East Waterford brigades. They came up here. Pat Keating of the West Waterford Brigade took off his shoes and crept barefoot up to the I.R.A. barracks, got 2 bombs, threw them into the fanlight, and the I.R.A. volunteers began to shoot at the barracks. There was a reply from the Black and Tans and from the I.R.A. in the barracks, and the I.R.A. lads made their way back to Pickardstown to the ambush positions. Behind me here is the main Tramore Road. Now, amazingly, this road is still in existence from the time of the ambush. Right across here would have ran the old railway line, the Waterford Tramore Railway. This was a bridge going in under here. The local I.R.A. set up barricades. So what they hoped for was that all the British lorries, the 4 of them, would have in this ambush position here. Across on the other side of the main road here, over by the shrine, you had all the East Waterford lads lined up there on the ditches. Right over up on the railway line was the West Waterford Brigade under Pax Whalen. It would have been a perfect ambush. Having made their way across country, the East Waterford Brigade assembled here. Now, I'm at the junction here of the new Tramore Road, where you can see the cars whizzing past. Behind me here is the old Tramore Road. and facing up directly from me here is the Ballynatton Road. And right in the junction of the corner here was 4 shotgun men. They were directly facing where the blockade was to be. Jerry Cronin, who was a commandant in the East Waterford Brigade, was slightly in front of me here. He had a revolver. It was his job to fire the signal shot that all the lorries had gone past here, turned into where the barricade is, under the bridge, the Tramore Railway Bridge, and there the ambush would begin. But it went wrong. When they arrived here, Pax Phelan of the West Waterford Brigade and Paddy Paul of the East Waterford Brigade began to inspect the guns of the men to be ready for the ambush, to ensure that everything was working perfectly, when all of a sudden a shot went off. Now, as I described earlier, there was certain men who were deemed to have drink taken, and it was one of those men who fired accidental shot. They should have been sent home or relegated to someplace else, because eventually it's because of one of those men the ambush turned into a complete disaster. I'll explain that a little later on. So now, as I said, the lorries came down here to turn around the corner into the ambush position. But what happened was, as they were coming down here, now some of the accounts differ, and most of the information I got is actually from the accounts of the men who were involved in the ambush. One of the men, the shotgun man who was over here in the ditch here, said that the lorries didn't come out the main road, that they came here behind me down the old Tramore Road. Many accounts differ. The Irish Independent, the national newspaper, said that 2 of the lorries came out the new Tramore Road and another 2 went out the main Cork Road and came down behind. I don't think this is true. That's only mentioned in the Irish Independent. That was the only source for that, and I think that's incorrect. But I do believe that 2 may have come out the main road, another 2 came here. What happened was that 2 lorries came out. The first one turned the corner into the ambush position, and just as that happened, one of those men, and he is named in the report, one of those men who were drink taken fired a shot fumbling around, because the shotguns had been taken off him and they were given revolvers for their own personal protection when the ambush took place. He fired a shot. The British soldiers heard the shot. They immediately pulled up. There was 2 lorries here behind me and 2 out on the road here where the garage is, the Pickardstown was. The English soldiers got out of the lorries, went through the fields here, came back down. Up here at the shrine was Michael McGrath of Waterford City and Tom O'Brien. They were the shotgunmen up on the road, as was Nicky Whittle, who produced a brilliant description of the Battle of Pickardstown. They didn't have a chance. The British soldiers went up here. They were here with their lorries and the machine guns on the lorries. Some of the accounts again differ. Some men say they had 40 rounds each. Jerry Cronin said he had only a revolver, he didn't have a shotgun. Nicky Whittle said he had only been given 12 rounds. Some accounts say that the men got 40 rounds, but this is probably faulty memory, which was written 30 years after the events. However, this certainly did not match the firepower of the English soldiers with their machine guns and what have you. So we go up towards the shrine and we'll give a description of what happened up there. The men of the East Waterford Brigade were lined up all along this ditch here with shotguns facing towards the metal bridge, where hopefully they expected the lorries to come to a halt and the ambush could go ahead. It went disastrously wrong. As I said, the men here, the shotgun men here, all of a sudden found that the British soldiers were behind them here in this field over here, and they were essentially trapped when the firing began. Well, right behind me is the shrine on the Ballynatton Road. And it was here where two men lost their lives. Michael McGrath from Polebury, he was in the East Waterford Brigade, and Tom O'Brien from Dunhill, County Waterford. And as I said, the British soldiers came up the road and also in the fields behind. And Michael McGrath jumped over the ditch here, onto the road here, and straight into a bunch of English soldiers. Tom O'Brien had a similar fate. They were captured alive and they were summarily shot in the head, and we know that because of the inquest which was held in Waterford. There was another two men shot. There was Nicky Whittle from Tramore and also Mick Wiley, who was shot in the thigh. Mick, luckily enough, was on the inside of the ditch and they were able to whisk him away. Nicky Whittle lay on the road here, wounded. He had been shot close to the spine and he was essentially momentarily paralysed, which essentially saved his life because the English thought they were dead. He has after being shot twice. The British soldiers came up, looked at him, and the officer said, "Is he dead?" And someone, "Yeah, he looks like he's dead." They turned him over and they shot him again, and the bullets went right through him and he lay on the ground. They got the bodies of Michael McGrath and they were able to identify Michael McGrath because he had his union card in his pocket. He was a member of the Carpenters Union in Waterford. And Tom O'Brien was the same. They couldn't identify Tom O'Brien, so they dragged him down the road, and Nicky Whittle said they could hear the boots of the two men scraped along the ground as they were dragging their bodies down the road to throw him into a lorry to bring him into Waterford. It went disastrously wrong. Dennis Madden was his name. He was an intelligence officer in the I.R.A. He actually got an opportunity to interview one of the British soldiers. They were of the Devon Regiment. And he told him, unaware of who he was, that if the ambush had gone ahead as planned, that it would have been probably the biggest disaster for the British Army in Ireland. Even bigger than Kilmichael up in Cork. But Dennis Madden says it's because of somebody being very foolish, having drink and going to the ambush, and ruined the whole ambush. When the British soldiers came back to look for Nicky Whittle, they presumed that his comrades had taken him away, taken his body away, presumed that he was dead. But in actual fact, Nicky was able to tumble over the ditch and he made his escape, going through fields down to his relation's house. And he was taken to a safe house, as was Mick Wiley. They were eventually taken from there in as far as the mental hospital in Waterford, where they were treated for the wounds in there. Now, Tom O'Brien was taken and was buried in Ballygunner Cemetery. As the cortege was going through Waterford City, a British soldier, a British officer, stopped the cortege, went over, lifted the tricolour from the coffin and looked at the coffin to see if there was a name on the coffin. There was no name on the coffin. He stood back, he saluted in a military fashion and left. It wasn't until after the truce that Tom O'Brien's name was put on the coffin. He rests today out in Ballygunner Cemetery. Michael McGrath was buried in Carlbarry Cemetery. And a very good friend of mine, the very well known, the late Bulligan Power, who was only a young fella, Michael McGrath would cycle around with Bulligan on the bar of his bicycle. And for the remainder of his life and all of his life, Bulligan Power went out and put greenstones, new greenstones, on Michael McGrath's grave in Carbally Church. So that's the story of the Pickardstown Ambush. Could have been great, but it turned out to be a disaster. But nonetheless, they were brave men, and we should always remember them. And still to the present day, on the 7th of January every year, and this is the 100th anniversary of the Pickardstown Ambush, people gather every year to lay wreaths and to commemorate and remember the men who fought here for a free Ireland. And finally, to summarise, how should we view the Pickardstown Ambush? Was it an ignominious failure? Were there many mistakes made? Well, I suppose the best way, you have to put it into context.
insofar as is that as was observed by Ivan Lennon in a forthcoming article by Ivan, whose father was heavily involved in the I.R.A. during that period, that it was a peculiar city insofar as it was probably, outside of Ulster, the most unionist city in Ireland. Now, this was evident in all the elections. In 1918, when Sinn Féin were winning seats all around Ireland, one of the exceptions was Waterford City, where John Redmond got in. When John Redmond died, his son Willie got in for a few years. He eventually died. Willie's wife got in, her name was Bridget, and she continued being re-elected to Waterford City until 1952. Now, there were a few Republicans in it, but it wasn't nothing Fianna Fáil got in that you could say that anything resembling a Republican viewpoint was elected. So you had that. Also, yeah, Waterford at that time was a very, very small place. It was essentially a big village. People essentially knew what you had for your breakfast in the mornings. Everybody knew everybody. We had two military barracks in Waterford, both of them on Barrack Street. A lot of people from Waterford would have joined the Irish Volunteers, and a lot of them would have signed up and hearing John Redmond's call for conscription and signed up. So you had an awful lot of people who were ex-British Army. The wives in particular seemed to be extremely vicious towards the Republican viewpoint and demonstrated that on many occasions at election meetings and any other type of meeting that they got an opportunity of screaming and howling at the Republicans. So it was difficult. But one thing in favour of the Republican organisation in Waterford City was the fact that they had about 4 dumps. Those dumps were never raided by the British. Now, I remember when I was young, I heard rumours about somebody squealed to the British about the ambush in Pickardstown. This is not sustained by the witness statements of the members, the I.R.A. men who fought at Pickardstown. Indeed, what they said was quite the opposite. They said that until they more or less arrived at Pickardstown, they didn't know where they were going. They knew there was an ambush on, but they never knew exactly where they were going. So we can rubbish that thing that somebody squealed. However, Ivan Lennon sent me an article on Pickardstown that he's working on, and in that he quotes a report to the Chief of Staff about it. The question was asked, should we court-martial the people who had drink taken? The other viewpoint that was sent up and is very relevant was the fact that most of these men didn't join the British Army. They were anti-conscription. They never fired a shot except maybe for some target practice. Now, to face people, and most of those British soldiers, I'm sure, would have fought in the First World War. So they would have seen some action. So, I mean, it's extremely difficult to go out knowing that you're going to face ferocious firepower, which the English had. Very well. They would have been very well trained in warfare, and as I said, they would have experienced warfare. So you had essentially ordinary men going out and again fighting in the night time. They would have left the mental hospital, as I said, around 7 o'clock, and before the action began, it was gone 12 o'clock in the night time. We'd probably no food, maybe very little bottles of water, what have you, to drink. So it would have been extremely stressful. And it failed because of that. No other reason. That's essentially the story of the Pickardstown ambush, but it needed a bit of context, and hopefully I've put that to it. Just to conclude, I almost gave my own life for the cause of Irish freedom, because on the day that I filmed the video out there on location, on 2 occasions I was nearly flattened on the Ballynatton Road, and with my impeccable timing, I choose the most terrible day to go out and videotape, between wind, rain and cold. But hope you enjoy the video, and again, thanks for all those people who directed me with various sources, and hope you enjoy the video. So until next time, from me, Dermot Power, goodbye. Rise up, Tommy Brine, rise up and tell me true. Didn't I go down to Pickardstown the night along with you?
We went to fight the foeman there, close by the great salt sea. And what befell, sure I needn't tell, 'twas for Ireland to be free.